Welcome to today's Daily Thought, where we're currently working our way through Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 to 14. And today we come to the end of verse 7 and the beginning of verse 8, where we're told that the redemption and the forgiveness that we have in Christ is all according to the riches of his grace, which he has lavished upon us. Grace is one of those wonderful biblical words. It speaks of something that is given freely, an undeserved favour, an act of kindness that is unmerited and unearned. And the heart of the gospel declares that God's salvation is an act of his grace, that God acts towards us in love and kindness when there is nothing in us to deserve such divine benevolence. And Paul couldn't put it any clearer than he does in chapter 2 of this letter to the Ephesians. In verses 8 and 9, he says this: "By grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." And this idea of grace is such a weighty concept that the word rarely stands on its own. One of the most well-known hymns in the English language is John Newton's that begins, "Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see." And you see, that word grace has to be qualified. There's an adjective put alongside it just to draw attention to its superlative quality. And so Newton tells us of God's amazing grace. And Paul does the same in verses 7 and 8. He can't just say according to his grace. He has to qualify that grace. He has to expand upon it. And so he says, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us. And the words riches and lavished just add to the already amazingness of God's grace, pointing to the wealth of his grace and his generosity with it. And so first of all, God is a rich God. He is no pauper. Elsewhere in this letter to the Ephesians, Paul uses this word riches to speak of God's treasure house of divine possessions. And so in chapter 1 verse 18, take a note of these verses and look at them later. 1:18, the riches of his glorious inheritance. Chapter 2 verse 4, God is rich in mercy. Chapter 2 verse 7, the immeasurable riches of his grace. Chapter 3 verse 8, the unsearchable riches of Christ. And chapter 3 verse 16, the riches of his glory. There is an abundance about God. There is a bountiful magnificence. So never fear that there is not enough grace for you. As Paul says in his letter to the Romans, where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. But secondly, not only is God rich in grace, he is unbelievably generous with this grace. Verse 8 says that he has lavished his grace upon us. That's such a beautiful word, isn't it? Other versions use the words showered, poured, superabounded. God lavished his grace upon us. God does not skimp on the giving of his grace. He does not hold back. And the word means to dispense something above and beyond what might be anticipated, to surpass the expected, to go further than the norm, to exceed the ordinary. So I would suggest that you meditate long and hard on that little phrase, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us. And I finish just with this last verse of a hymn written just over 100 years ago by a hymn writer called Annie Flint. His love has no limits, his grace has no measure. his power no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus he giveth and giveth and giveth again. Amen.